Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
With me tonight, the Conservative MP, former member of the Cabinet under Theresa May, Damien Green, the Shadow Health Secretary, former Deputy Chair of the Labour Party, John Ashworth, Afua Hirsch, journalist, broadcaster, author of a book on British identity, Tim Martin, chairman and founder of the pub chain Wetherspoon, and the columnist for the online magazine Spiked and the author of What Women Want, Fun, Freedom and an End to Feminism, Ella Whelan. And as always, you can, of course, argue the toss at home. Use our hashtag BBCQT on social media. We've got a lot of questions here, so we'll get cracking with Tom Pottrell, please.
If the so-called Brexit dividend does not materialise, who should bear the burden of tax for greater NHS funding?
Crucial. We've heard that tax is going to be raised, that the NHS is going to get a funding increase. Who should bear the burden of the tax? John Ashworth.
Well, Tom's question started with an if. There isn't going to be a Brexit dividend, it's a Brexit deceit. The money is going to be raised by extra borrowing and tax going up, tax that all of us in this room pay. And the question now for Conservatives is it VAT going up? Is it the basic rate of income tax? In fact, the Chancellor, Philip Hammond, is making a speech tonight saying that tax is going to go up. I just wish Theresa May had been straight with the British people on Sunday and not take us for fools.
It was Jeremy Corbyn who said in February he's going to use funds returned from Brussels after Brexit.
But she's talking about...
No, Corbyn said it. You just said it doesn't exist. But she's going to use the funds returned after Brexit to invest in public services.
But she's talking about spending money from next year onwards.
Well,
and the year after that. Jeremy Corbyn's talking beyond 2023, 2024. This funding settlement that Theresa May has announced is between now and 2023. And Theresa May couldn't explain where the money's coming from because she knows, as Damien knows, that tax is going up. The Tories are putting up tax. And here's the thing, right? They could have put up tax last year. They could have put it up the year before. They've waited until the waiting lists have gone to 4 million, until 26,000 people are waiting over 60 days for cancer treatment, until 560,000 people are on trolleys in corridors. They've waited until they've pushed the NHS to the absolute brink, and now they're putting up tax. They should have done it years ago.
OK. And surely, hold on to a second. The question that Tom asked, who should bear the burden of the tax? And would Labour presumably put taxes up, but who should bear the burden of it?
Well,
just very briefly, not writing into a long answer.
Labour said that the wealthiest in society, the top 5%, and the big corporations who have had billions of pounds worth of tax cuts should pay a little bit extra tax so we can have quality care for all of us in society. That was our answer for the election.
I think that the essence of Brexit is that there will be a dividend and the people who voted for it will think that there will be a dividend. The Australian High Commissioner, just retiring, said no one ever lost out from free trade. We pay a lot of tariffs to the EU. It's collected on non-EU imports. We'll lose those. We'll regain control of our fisheries and a raft of other things which suggest that if we become a free trading nation, we'll do better. That's a dividend, not a direct one, but an indirect one.
So your dividend isn't the one written on the side of the bus. Your dividend is the advantages of leaving and the cumulative effect.
Well, we immediately save 10 billion a year, and if politicians decide... We immediately save our net contribution. We agreed on this show before the referendum, and most people now say it's not 17 billion a year, it's 10 billion a year.
Leave Brexit for a moment. Who should bear the burden of tax for the NHS?
Well, who actually bears the burden is the good old political agenda, and really that's one for the political parties to decide. Everyone will have to pay a little bit more, perhaps.
Ella Whelan.
I mean, coming back to Tom's question about who should pay for this, I think the problem is at the moment with the NHS is that even though it's a great service everyone realises that there's something very real wrong with it, in the fact that in large areas of it it's vastly ineffective. We've got scandals left, right and centre. There's a deep problem with it. And so if we had a political plan that said that spending was going to be used in a way that people agreed with in relation to what everyone wants, was better pay for more doctors and nurses, more hospitals, better care, especially for the elderly, and people with learning disabilities in social care, that would, I think people would be happy to bear the brunt of that in relation to paying for that. The idea, the social motive behind a national health service is a fundamental good. It's something that I think, on the whole, British people like. The problem is the NHS has become this unwieldy sort of monster that isn't fit for purpose anymore. What we need to do, rather than kind of bickering about either the Brexit costs or the Brexit dividend and all this kind of nonsense, is get back to actually what it is the NHS needs. And that's a kind of holistic overview of what it's meant to do, and then funding can come into it.
So at this stage, you're against what the government's doing, promising to increase the funding?
I'm not against it, but it's a continual tactic to just fling money at the NHS in a kind of way that doesn't seem to have any positive outcome. So the question of what's wrong with the NHS isn't just a lack of funds. Okay. It's the way that it's being run at the moment.
Damien Green, you just fling money at it.
Ella's half right, I think. I mean, if I can go to the original question very directly, some of it will come from taxation. We will all pay more. It should come for, and Theresa said that, and Philip is saying it tonight. It's perfectly obvious. Some of it will come from the fact that we're not paying this contribution. We can argue about how much the contribution is, but we do pay a contribution. Eventually we'll stop paying that contribution, but more of it will have to come from taxation. I thought John was heroic trying to turn this into a bad news story. We will be increasing NHS spending by 3.4% a year. At the last election, when Labour was promising free this, free that, unicorns on every high street, even Labour at the last election said that an increase of 2.2% would make the NHS the envy of the world. We'll be increasing spending by 3.4%. It absolutely has to go with reform.
You've cut it and squeezed it for years, Damien.
You can always tell when a politician's losing an argument, he just resorts to heckling at the start of question time. John, you're losing this argument.
Give over.
This is a good news story, and
right,
the fact is, it does need a plan.
Tell us the good news.
Well,
how much are taxes going to go up?
Well, taxes will go up
who's
to the
pay?
half.
That was the question.
Well, everyone will pay. Let's be honest. Corporations will pay. Individuals will pay. If you put up tax, you have to do this. But most people in this country want an NHS that is the envy of the world, and we have to do two things. We have to increase the spending on it, which means higher taxes, but we also have to reform it in a way that, sadly, the previous Labour government that John worked for did pour money at the NHS, but didn't reform anything. And the fact that we've actually got a 10-year plan means that people who do not normally praise the government for healthcare, like the Royal College of GPs, have said this week, this pledge represents a significant amount of money, and this is certainly encouraging. It's been supported by the Royal College of Physicians. It's been supported.
I can read the list as well.
It's been supported by the Royal College of Nursing.
Just leave a list a moment. Your Prime Minister said that this was a Brexit dividend.
It is partly that.
You've never believed in a Brexit dividend. You said there'd be lower economic growth and the government would have less money to spend. That was your line when you were a Remainer.
You know what my views on Europe are, and I campaigned for Remain.
Do you believe she's telling the truth when she says there's a Brexit dividend? Or were you wrong when you said there wouldn't be one?
What she said was that some of it would come from the money that Tim talks about, and the rest of it, we would all have to contribute a bit more, is what the Prime Minister said, and she's exactly right. That's the honest way to approach health spending. Right. What happens to growth in the economy? I was pessimistic about that. Okay. Let's see what happens. But actually, nobody can make this a bad news story about the NHS. Right. This is the best thing to happen to the NHS for many years.
Everybody can tell a politician on question time when they... sign of a politician on question time is that they just keep talking and won't stop.
And the audience approves.
Look at the number. Well, do they approve? We'll hear from them in a moment. There are a lot of people with their hands up. But Afra Hirsch, first of all.
Well, I agree with earlier Damien, which was the Damien Green who predicted that leaving Brexit would not produce a dividend. Actually, it would produce a real-time slowdown in economic growth. I think it's a real shame that the government has been dishonest about the dividend because it distracts attention from the really important question of how we're going to fund the NHS and what it needs. And I think it is important to welcome the fact that this is an announcement to put more money into the NHS. The NHS is not broken. It has many committed, passionate people who work in it who do an amazing job. It has British people who, by and large, believe in the concept of free universal healthcare, which is, I think, one of the most precious things that we have in this country. It needs funding. The problem is that what's been announced is not enough to reverse the chronic levels of underfunding over years and years. And that is what we need. And we need to look at what this will do. You know, we have problems that are so systemic in the NHS that the level of money that is needed far exceeds what's been announced. And this goes to your question. Who is going to pay for that? And that comes to a bigger point about what kind of country we want to be. You know, it's ironic that Brexit is often framed about what kind of country we want to be, getting back control. At the moment, we are a country where the poorest proportionally pay a higher level of tax than anyone else out of their income. We do not have a progressive system of taxation. If you increase tax, as it seems we will do, it's only going to compound that problem.
Okay. Let's go to some of our audience, but what you're actually saying is that the idea that there'll be a Brexit dividend is trying to make it seem painless, when in fact it's going to come out of taxation.
Exactly.
There is no Brexit dividend, your view. You, sir, there on the right there. Fourth row back, yes, you.
I think we need to ask ourselves why we're here in the first place. I think that, yes, we can blame a part of this on the fact that there's more people in this country, but actually the truth is that we're getting unhealthier as a society. Diabetes is on the rise, mental health is on the rise, cancer is on the rise. That's not because these are new illnesses, it's because as individuals, we're unhealthier. Now, we can pump money into a reactive situation by putting money into the NHS, or we can be proactive and try and deal with these things by making our kids healthier, by looking at things that actually don't cost very much money.
Are you against the increase in funding?
I am, because I think we haven't exhausted all the ideas. We haven't been innovative enough. So, for example, when there was a shortage of teachers, Teach First was introduced. When there was a shortage of mental health social workers, Think Ahead was introduced. There's a lot of things we can do before we just throw money at the problem.
John Ashworth, what do you say to that?
Well, I agree with some of your question, but I disagree. The NHS desperately needs money. It's gone through the biggest financial squeeze in its history. We've lost 16,000 beds. But you're right about staff. We're short of 40,000 nurses. We're short of 10,000 doctors. But here's the thing, right? You're right. We have to be investing more in what we call the public health budgets, prevention budgets, encouraging people to live healthier. But actually, that element of the funding settlement wasn't even announced this week. Theresa May said that's going to be next year, which means more money for prevention and public health won't be until 2020. So there's a sleight of hand that went on this week.
The woman over there in green. Yes, you.
I think a lot of people are deluded with this. I work within the voluntary sector and the NHS, and you can't... and the Institute of Fiscal Studies, which is a right-wing think tank, is saying that you need at least a 4% increase, along with the NHS, Chief Executive NHS England. Not only, have we got an ageing population and there's been a 1% increase over the last 8 years because of austerity, it doesn't come in silos. Social care, I've got a friend who's a social worker and is saying it's absolute crisis on the wards because she works with people with liver problems, and the benefits around PIP and universal credit are causing chaos around homelessness and debt and family breakdown, and it's just not a silo. Yes, you can't just bung a load of money, I agree, but it's all part of social care and a bigger system as well that needs to be looked at.
Thank you.
So, Labour wants to increase taxes, Conservatives want to increase taxes on ordinary working people. On the Brexit dividend, the whole point is that being out of the EU, the government has control of what it does, whether it's nationalise the rail, subsidise industries, whatever. The alternative in the EU is the removal of trade unions and destruction of working people's living standards, Greece, Italy, Spain. And the key to it is not raising taxes. The question is boosting the economy. Productivity, our living standards for the first decade in 200 years have not increased. This is because the Bank of England will indicate is because of the lack of productivity.
You're giving us a whole economic history.
The British economy, we need to boost our productivity to increase living standards, and the tax looks after itself.
All right, the woman here, yes, what are you saying?
I'm sorry, but the very idea that Theresa May should lie to the public about there being a Brexit dividend. It's just astonishing. From the minute that Leave put, let's give the NHS the £350 million a week that the EU takes every week. That was the opening campaign of the entire Leave campaign. Every billboard, everywhere. They said that money was never there in the first place. It was £250 million, not £350 million. And that money is used for lots of other things, so that could never have happened. It's just been lying about the NHS. They've weaponised the NHS to convince people who look around and see what the Tories have done to it, and they say, everything is ruined, everything is falling. Oh, let's leave because we're going to get £350 million a week extra for the NHS.
So what's your reaction to the news that the spending on the NHS is going up and taxation will have to
It's
go
great
up as
that
well?
we are getting more money for the NHS, but to relate it in any way to being a Brexit dividend is just a flat-out lie.
So you should just say it's a tax increase?
Yeah, well, it's a tax increase.
All right. And you said at the back there.
John Ashworth talks about the Tories raising taxes and increasing public borrowing, but isn't that exactly what a Corbyn government would do, but on a much larger scale?
Well, we've been upfront that taxes... We've been upfront in our manifesto that we would increase some taxes on the wealthiest in society and the big corporations. The difference is the Tories in their manifesto said they wouldn't be putting up tax, and now they are putting up tax.
Ella.
I mean, it's important to remember that the problems that the NHS is currently facing date way back before Brexit, and the idea that Brexit is going to either be the answer or the utter destruction of the NHS is kind of ridiculous and a bit historically illiterate, I'm afraid. The great thing that Brexit did from my point of view was open up a whole new possibility of looking at politics and the institutions that we deal with and the way we run things differently. And I think that there's much an argument to completely rethinking the way that we run the NHS. And that doesn't mean privatising it. That doesn't mean, tweaking bits here and there. I mean, getting back to kind of ripping it all up and starting again and making a national health service that's kind of has a social motive to it that works properly. I think we need to think big on this issue.
Can I ask Tom Pottrell, who asked the question in the first place, what he thinks? Tom, what's your view? Or what's your view of what you've heard, perhaps, is a fairer way to put it?
I concur with John, to be honest. As a Labour Party member, I'm all for taxing the wealthiest to bear the burden of great NHS funding.
And you said that. Yes.
I think that they really need to remove the politics from the whole question, because by keeping it political, you're never going to make any progress. I mean, Damien has covered the government's announcement and John rubbishes it, even though the Labour Party would like to spend more on health. During the election, Theresa May decided to try to deal with long-term care, and the Labour Party tagged it a dementia tax, and again it sort of got rubbished and became a vote loser. I think you really need an independent organisation to actually look at the NHS. It's obvious it needs more money, but it also needs massive reform. And I work as a financial advisor. I advise a lot of GPs. I think 2/3 of GPs who retired last year retired early because of the tax on their pensions if they continue working. So you're losing hundreds of GPs, just as one example, because the government has a policy somewhere else that is designed to tax the value of a person's pension fund. And so there are so many inefficiencies within the whole system that unless you take it out of politics completely...
And how do you take it out of politics?
You appoint people who know what they're doing, and you actually put it...
I think everyone likes the NHS, and it's done a fantastic job over the years. It's struggling now, and it's hardest probably on the people who actually work in it. The arguments around it tend to be very insular, and what we should be doing is looking at France, Australia, Canada, at the other systems, and see how they go, because I think some of them have better outcomes than we do, and that seems to be the case. But it tends to be what the Labour said, what the Conservatives said, which is what you're saying. It's too political.
But we have had, haven't we, Damien Green, independent... Andrew Dillnott did a famous report on social welfare, and nobody took any notice.
I wanted to pick that up because, I mean, it is very easy to say, oh, just give it over to experts and depoliticise it. The fact that everyone is so passionate, you can see from this discussion about the NHS, is precisely why it's a big political issue and always will be, because politicians have to decide how much to tax you and therefore how much to pay for you. But if I can pick up the point made by the lady in the green up there, who I sense from her question is not a natural Conservative supporter, but I completely agreed with the basic point she was making, that you've got to see this in the context of social care as well. And the government's going to put a green paper out later this year at the same time as the NHS reform plan comes up, quite specifically so that we can look at the two together, because you're absolutely right. We not only need to get the health service right, we need to get social care right, and that needs cross-party agreement, just as we have with pensions over a 10, 20-year period.
It's not just social care. I think we need to separate out the issue of efficiency. It's very popular to say we don't need to raise more in tax or from a Brexit dividend, we can just get rid of inefficiency in the NHS. That's a lovely idea. We need to reform the NHS, but that's not the nub of the issue. The nub of the issue is that we have had over a decade of austerity that has created multiple problems that have put funding squeezes on the NHS, and you can't take the politics out of this, because politics helped create this problem. It's not just social care, it's also homelessness, it's poverty. These things are all combining to put a huge strain on our public services.
But what about the idea of cross-party agreement on the NHS? Would you favour that? I mean, if these two could get together?
But how can you get cross-party agreement on the NHS? The problem is it's not just about the NHS. So local authorities are on their knees at the moment. That is creating huge problems that the NHS are having to deal with. That is a political issue. That is a Conservative addiction to austerity that is not working economically. You know, the gentleman over there said, well, what we need is to achieve economic growth. I mean, I don't think there's a person in this room who wouldn't like to achieve economic growth, because neither party seems to have the answer. The Conservatives are using this zombie economics of austerity that economists agree does not work. And I'm afraid to say that because of the confusion around Brexit, I don't think that Labour is presenting a convincing argument at the moment as well. And the reality is we do not have a vision that is going to be capable of reversing the real damage that has been done by austerity.
The man in the middle there.
I think the majority of us agree that the NHS needs more money. I mean, that's fundamental. However, I'm yet to hear anything from Jonathan Ashworth about the amount of money that we're putting in. The Conservatives are putting 3.4% into the NHS when Labour only offered 2%. John, can we have some praise for the government on this? You know, anything whatsoever that more money is going into the NHS?
Well, for 2 years, I've been calling for more money in the NHS, and Tories have been telling me it's not about money. In the first year...
He didn't say that. He said Labour promised 2, and the Tories are doing 3.4.
And in cash...
Will you give praise to them for doing that?
And what that means is that next year, under the Tory plans...
anything
next year, under the Tory plans, that means the NHS gets 4 billion extra. Under Labour's plans, next year, it would have got 7.7 billion extra, because we knew, or we can see, what an absolute crisis the NHS is in today, so we deliberately said, put more money in now. We've had the Red Cross, for goodness sake, saying that last winter it was a humanitarian crisis in our NHS, which is why we were saying put more money in now. So we'd have put 7.7 billion in. Now, we've heard that you also need to deal with the social care provision for the elderly and the vulnerable in society. Because of deep cuts, £6 billion worth of cuts over the last 8 years, 400,000 very elderly and vulnerable people do not get the care support that they used to get before these cuts. That is costing the NHS £3 billion a year. And Damien says there's going to be a plan for that. There was no extra money whatsoever this week for social care. That's a disgrace.
There was £2 billion last year, and you know that well, John. All right, let's have this discussion in a more grown-up way. There was $2 billion for social care last year. We can argue about numbers.
Hang on. I agree. Let's have a more grown-up discussion, because it irritates me as well when politicians play with numbers. Because that really isn't... I have to come back to the fact that this isn't what's wrong with the NHS, and flinging whatever kind of amount of money you want at it is not going to solve the issues. I mean, in specific areas, the way in which the NHS works is kind of deeply ineffective. Everyone can kind of relate to the idea, you know, any over 50 you meet comes out of a GP's office with a fistful of pills. Because, you know, since 2004, GPs' pay has been incentivised on the basis of how many prescriptions they give out. This has not caused any less deaths. This has not prevented anyone from getting sick. In fact, side effects off of an excess of prescriptions is a big problem within the NHS. We're not thinking sensibly about how to treat people, how to cure the sick, how to fix this problem. You can bicker about numbers all you like, but the problem is the government has done that for years, Labour and the Conservatives, and the rest of us are kind of bored of it.
I'll take 2 more points and then we'll go on. man in the very back with the spectacles, and then you on there, yes. You so briefly, if you would, because we must get moving.
I think, back to the original question,
yes.
We all have to pay for the NHS, whether it's for people that are rich, that make the money from us here through tax or indirect taxation. I agree with the financial advisor. We need to take the NHS out of the control of the government and stop kicking the can down the road. We need a long-term plan that invests in our society, whether it's care in the community or the NHS, to put the problems right that successive governments have left us with. And I don't see any answers by the panel that addresses that.
Why do you think it's become a political football? Why do you think? Because when the Beveridge report came out after the war, it was generally accepted by both parties. The National Health Service would be set up.
I think because our political system is broken. The way that we work is one government either buys the electorate or makes it sure that the government that's elected is unelectable after. So they use it to score points. And it's juvenile. I think I've had enough of it.
And I'll take the woman on the gangway there that I pointed to, and then we'll go on. Yes. Brief point, if you would.
It's actually very painful to watch this debate because I'm speaking to the two ministers here. While you're playing tit for tat with who's to blame, who's going to do what, who isn't, there are real people out there suffering. The social care provision is failing families. You know, you need to get your acts together. I could probably do a better job myself. This is just poor management. Not acceptable. You know, we're all real people and we need action. We don't need to keep listening to the spin, the promises, tit for tat. Get it sorted out. You know, that's the thing. We don't mind paying a bit more, but sort it. Make a promise, stick to it. Act like grown-ups, get your heads together, sort it out for the people.
I don't think that's fair on politicians, actually. If you live in a democracy, you have to have politicians, and there's no magic wand to be waved at for any country in the world. They are deeply intractable problems, but we should certainly look abroad and see what they do there and try and find something beyond what we're discussing today might be the answer.
There are very real people suffering, so...
Fine. Well, Tim to the rescue of politicians as a class.
The top man.
Happy to oblige, chap.
We must go on. Just before we do, we're going to be in Exeter next Thursday, at Exeter and Devon next Thursday. The week after that, in King's Lynn. If you want to come, there on the screen are the details of how to apply. I'll give them again at the end. And we're sticking with a sort of health issue here too, so let's just go to this one. Sasha Kutan, please. Can we have your question?
Should cannabis be legalised for recreational use?
Should cannabis be legalised for recreational use? Recreational being the key bit of that. Ella Whelan.
Yes, and that is not because I think dope is particularly cool or a great thing to get into. I think most of us will agree that cannabis for recreational use, you might toy around with it when you're young, but most of us get over that and it's not a kind of sensible thing to get into. The principled issue on this is that people should be allowed to decide what they put into their bodies, whether that be drink, whether that be drugs, whatever it is. We have a trust in people's, sense of sensibleness and sense of knowing what they want. And that shouldn't be a question for the state, that should be a question for individuals. I think we can be very safe in saying that if we decriminalise cannabis tomorrow, if it was, you could light up on the street outside, we would not have swathes of people running to, dope shops to light up. It is not a kind of, it is not a social problem at the moment. The principled point is you decide what goes into your body. You make your own decisions.
Interestingly, it was, of course, former Conservative leader William Hague, who'd been against it in the past, who came out this week calling for legalisation. Afua, what do you make of it?
I'm actually a little conflicted on this issue. I think that I've got a lot of time for the arguments about legalising cannabis for recreational use, but in large part, I think, because you hear people making these impassioned pleas against any consideration of legalising cannabis. And actually, Sajid Javid, talking about needing to address the use of cannabis for medical use, said very clearly, of course, this won't get us any closer to legalising it for recreational use. We would never do that. Why? We tolerate drugs that are far more harmful. Alcohol is recognised medically to be significantly more harmful than cannabis. Yet no one would ever suggest that we criminalise cannabis. I think the issue for me is that the evidence that I've seen suggests it's not a one-solution answer. So if you look at what's going on in the Netherlands, there's a lot of concern about... it's been described as a narco-state. I mean, I think that's an exaggeration, but there are concerns about the ways in which an underground trade still thrives. If you look at the US states that have legalised cannabis, there are actually more people from minority backgrounds being penalised through criminal law around the drug trade since they legalised cannabis use. So it's actually quite a complex picture. What I would like to see is a sophisticated debate instead of these really simplistic, scaremongering messages from politicians who kind of draw on this weird cultural taboo around cannabis use. Let's have a rational debate. Let's measure the pros and the cons. Let's weigh the costs and the benefits and come to an informed decision instead of drawing on taboos and fear to make the decision for us.
So, Tim, you flog a more dangerous drug, then, at Wetherspoons, than what is being proposed.
Yes, I'm a bit worried about this. If you're going to choose what to ban cannabis. That's my point of view. But
that's a commercial decision.
It's a commercial decision. I think since cabinet ministers and Bill Clinton smoked cannabis but never inhaled, it's got a lot stronger. And there's a lot of evidence now from what the layman can gather, or the laywoman, we can't say that, the layman can gather, that it's causing psychotic problems, lots of problems which weren't evident in the past. So I think you have to be very careful about legalising it. What I would do is have a very close look, agreeing with what Afua said, have a very close look at Amsterdam, California and other places in a few years and keep it, legalise it for medical use, but have a look what happens before you do anything else. Right. Don't make it worse.
I don't normally take people who shout it out, but there's somebody was shouting out, and I just want to get... It was you, was it? Yes. Hold on, wait till the microphone gets to you. Right.
It's just like any other drug. You know, tobacco, alcohol, if you abuse it, you're going to get ill from it, straight off. If you smoke cannabis, it's not a problem. You'll be fine from it. If you do abuse it, with the strong stuff that's available now, you can develop problems, serious health issues.
You're in favour of legalisation?
Yeah, totally. The amount of people that would get work from it, you would open up empty units for growing, you would give people jobs, the amount of tax that would be generated from this. You worried about money for the NHS? Legalise cannabis. you allow people to sit, and I mean the same thing as well, you allow gambling machines in your pubs. That's another addiction.
So, Damien Green, you can fund your NHS.
Yes, but it might make it worse. I mean, this may be a first, but I agree with Afua. I'm conflicted on this as well, because it seems to me what we need to do, first of all, we do actually need better research. We've not actually looked at this in a coherent way. For a long time, that we've actually looked at what is a balance of harm. The harm on one side is clearly that Tim's right, that people have this, I think people are older, sort of remember hippies in the 60s and think, oh yeah, you know, the odd joint here and there didn't do them any harm. Actually, some of the stuff that's out there today is a lot stronger, a lot more dangerous, a lot more likely to induce mental health problems and psychosis. And it won't be articulate sort of middle-class kids at university who probably end up being hooked. It will be kids with nothing else in their lives, and they will be the ones. I don't think this is funny. I think they'll be the people whose lives are absolutely ruined by it. However, on the other side is the fact that for a large number of younger people, the law is a bit of a joke, because it's so easily available, it's so easy to get, it looks as though we've got this law in place, but we're not actually enforcing it. That in itself is a harm to society, because people ought to take the law seriously. So I think it is time for, whether it's a Royal Commission or something like that, a proper look at this, and maybe other drugs as well. So let's actually have a hierarchy of harm and work out where the balance lies, where we can minimise the amount of harm.
Hang on, Dave, I've just got to come back on that, because you had the gentleman here raising the question of the fact of abuse. The fact that actually if you trust people to make decisions, they'll generally make a sensible decision, and people know that if you smoke 40 a day, every day, the likelihood is you're going to get sick from that, and the same applies to cannabis. You've just now, Damien, talked about the fact that it isn't going to be articulate middle-class kids or articulate middle-class people who are going to be suffering from this. It's going to be, essentially working-class people who kind of don't know better, don't know when to put the joint down, don't know what's good for them, that's going to suffer from this. That seems to be incredibly paternalistic and bordering on anti-working class.
It's going to be ridiculous. It's just what happens. It's what happens with alcohol abuse.
Why can working class people not make informed, sensible decisions
they can.
the same
Most
as
of them
particularly
do.
middle-class kids?
But statistically, the likelihood is that if you feel that if you are disadvantaged, if you've got fewer life chances, you will make worse decisions. It's not necessarily your fault. It's just what happens.
The principle of... hang on. So this is what the state is
tobacco.
terrible at. This is what the state is terrible at, is trusting people. And the principle that individuals should make their own life choices, you don't seem to be able to get on board.
Let's more members. You said that.
Society, we're not being pragmatic enough. We're not looking at the evidence, and the evidence shows that cannabis does lead to psychotic issues. We need to have reports conducted, medical studies. We can't have positions. We have to look at the facts first, and I feel like people, they think that cannabis, it's good, but the reality is we don't know the scientific facts behind it.
But he says, you were saying you think there have been 7 years of study, didn't you?
Apparently in this country, from what I've read, for the past 7 years you can apply for a Home Office licence to grow medicinal cannabis only for research use.
Oh, right. But,
so the government will do it. There's hydroponic shops all over the country.
Okay.
And so the government have already half allowed us to already start growing our own.
If
the police beat down our door, we can get sent to the local prison for it.
John Ashworth.
Just legalise it. It just makes more sense.
Just legalise it, John. What do you say?
I'm afraid I don't agree. I think there is much medical evidence now that cannabis, because it's what is available is much stronger than what used to be available, leads to psychosis, to depression, to anxiety. That in it will store up huge problems on our mental health services, which are already overstretched because they've never had, mental health services under both governments have never had the priority that they should have had.
So do you go along with Damien's idea, perish the thought, you might agree with him, that there should be a Royal Commission to look into this?
I think there should be a rational debate, and I don't know if it's a Royal Commission,
but... As a Royal Commission.
I mean, I agree that we should look at this seriously, because I think, for example, the government were correct to allow the granting of licences for medical purposes this week, and we need to look at that further. But I just want to make this broader point. You, sir, quite rightly said, when people were saying, you know, it leads to problems, those are the people who abuse it. But people will abuse it in the same way they abuse Class A drugs. And the number of deaths, drug-related deaths, is the highest it's ever been in this country since the 90s. And people abuse alcohol. My dad abused alcohol. He drank himself to death. And in this country, sorry to put it, I don't want to put a downer on the proceedings, but, you know, people
the majority of people don't, though.
No, but people do abuse drugs, and they do abuse alcohol, and we have never given those people the support they deserve. So I'm all in favour of having, you know, looking at it properly, but if we're going to do it, let's put proper investment in addiction support services.
But hang on a second, John. You put these three things together, smoking, drugs and alcohol, nothing is done about, as Tim knows. People go to the pub and they buy. Why can't you look at cannabis in the same way as you look at alcohol? Some people die from overuse, but most people don't.
We did ban smoking in pubs, actually, which has been a plus. So restricting what people do can work. There are less people who smoke. It's a healthier atmosphere, and generally smokers now think that's better. So restrictions can work sometimes.
All right. I think we should go on, because we've got other...
I just want to quickly put a reality check on this idea that if we legalise cannabis, it's going to fund the NHS. Because if you look at what's happening in the US, basically corporates are taking over the cannabis market, and these are corporations we know, if you look at recent history, they're not going to be paying tax. They're going to be offshoring their profits. They're going to be monopolising the trade.
Cynical.
So it's a lovely idea that it would be this cottage industry that will empower lots of kind of small business owners and spread love. But the reality is it's just going to become another huge corporate interest that is not going to filter back into the system. But at the same time, I agree. I think you can scare people with side effects, but alcohol has very serious side effects when it's abused. There's no talk about making alcohol illegal. So I think, to me, there's a lot of hypocrisy in this debate, and that's what I would like us to
tried that once and it didn't work.
I'm not advocating it, but why not?
They tried it in America. Jessica Boyle, let's have your question, talking of America.
After recent images of children being caged, is it right that we're rolling out the red carpet for Donald Trump?
He's coming here... coming here and going to meet the Queen and all that. Tim?
Tricky issue. He's obviously a slightly weird guy, to put it mildly. But the Americans know that as well, and he's had to change one of his very recent controversial policies in the last few hours because of outrage in America, never mind over here. He represents the American people, who they're our friends and our allies. It's a great democracy. We might not be here without them. And I think that he should be invited over here. He's representing them. We can always give him a telling off in this country.
In other words, when you say he represents them, you mean he keeps his word to the American people, that he does what he said he'd do when he was elected?
I think
he's a good politician in that way. Is that
no? He's the head of state. They had a choice between Clinton and Trump. They chose him by a narrow majority, but he's representing that country as president. It's important to us. We'd be in trouble without them, I feel. So he should be accorded the civility, and the Queen, when he comes over here, can tell him how many beans make 5.
John Ashworth.
I just think those pictures of children in cages was heartbreaking. This man is disgusting. He has, of course, he has to come here. He's the President of the United States, and, you know, people of the United States voted for him, and we're always going to have a strong friendship with the people of the United States. But let's not make any bones about it. He's foul. It is obnoxious what he is doing. He should not have been putting those children in cages. And also, it's not just that. It's the fact he's pulled out of all the climate change agreements. It's the stuff he's trying to do, or he's doing on steel tariffs. He is making the world less safe. He's making the world more polluted. He's making the world less secure. I mean, look, I understand why he's going to go here, or come here, but let's not give him any red carpet or make it a pleasant experience.
So what are you going to do as a senior? What are you going to do as a senior member of the Labour Party when he comes and you're invited to hear him speak or to receptions with him there?
I doubt I'll be invited to hear him speak. You're more likely to get an invitation than me, Dave. I'd have thought to an event like that. Maybe the government.
Are you going to protest against him?
What date is it? It's in. I think
you're busy doing something else.
I think and the reason I ask is I think it coincides with the Durham Miners Gala, and I think I'm going to be at the Durham Miners Gala.
All right.
I think.
So they might as well.
Damien Green.
I think
disgusting and foul are the words that John Ashworth used. Do you go with those?
I think the policy was disgusting, and I'm glad that he's come around to reversing it very quickly. It was an appalling thing to do. It's not the way to do immigration control. And as I say, I'm glad he stopped it. And rather like everyone else, you know, there is a however to this, that if we cancel a visit at this stage, then it's disrespecting him, which many people will think that's fine, but it's also disrespecting the presidency of the United States. And that isn't in our long-term national interests. I mean, I know from my time in government that one of the strongest and most helpful security cooperations we have is between our security services and the American security services. And it is quite likely that as we speak tonight, there is some operation going on that might prevent a terrorist outrage in Britain. And we owe the Americans thanks for the information they will be sharing with us and we will be sharing with them for that. Because that sort of thing happens on a daily basis. So I think, you know, to some extent, we need to grit our teeth and say the Trump presidency is going to be really difficult for friends of America from the rest of the world, whether it's Britain or the rest of Europe. Democratic countries in the rest of the world are finding this very uncomfortable. But it's actually in all our interest to stay friendly with America as a country, with the American institutions, because at root, it's a great democracy. I think their democratic institutions will survive Trump, and we will still want to be friends at the end of it, because it's good for democracy there, and it's good for us in this country.
You're obviously bursting to speak, so I have to come to you, yes. No, not to you. Sorry, I'm so sorry. I come to me. Woman in the second row from the back. I will come to you.
Of course we want to stay friends with the Americans, but really it won't happen, but it would be absolutely wonderful on July the 13th if there was a complete press, media blackout and he got no publicity at all. It would make him furious.
But it will be fake news.
It would be wonderful. He would not, for an egotistical misogynist like Trump, to have no attention when he comes lording it to England.
He'll have
visiting
attention
the Queen.
from the American
I would
press.
love it.
All right. And you say in blue, then. wait for the microphone comes to you. Yeah.
He doesn't seem to be the friend of any country at all. He turns his back on people as soon as he's met them. The French guy who he was friends with when the French guy went to visit.
Macron,
all of a sudden,
the President of France, who you have to call Mr. President.
Mr. President. He just seems to turn his back on people straight away. You know.
Okay. Ella.
I mean, it was an incredibly distressing policy, and I'm very glad, as I'm sure everyone is, that it's been reversed. But I think what we get into danger of is treating Trump like an aberration. And yes, he is particularly unhinged at times, and your mouth gapes open when you're watching either the stuff that he's tweeting or what he's saying in the White House. But the problem with the immigration policy in the US is long-standing. I mean, what Trump is doing at the moment is not an aberration. Under the Obama government, Obama ramped up the deportation of Haitians, including pregnant women who are being separated from their families. I mean, America has a very long and pretty dark history in relation to immigration. And I think the shrill discussion about Trump at the moment, that he's some kind of evil, permatanned monster who, the Queen has to snub, and it's almost like a virtue signalling thing coming now that, you have to hate Trump, blocks a sensible political discussion about what is wrong with immigration policy in the UK. I mean, the question of children in cages was a shocking one, but the Washington Post and NPR sent reporters to the deportation centres in the US, and they couldn't find caged children. Some of the images that were being put out on social media were from 2014. There's a lot of hysteria around this. I mean, you don't have to talk about caged children. Anyone who knows anything about Yarlswood over here knows that you don't have to panic about caged children to have an opinion that lots of the West's immigration policy is deeply flawed.
All right.
When has it gone too far? When do we say to Trump, no, what you're doing now has gone too far, we don't want you to have to come to this country? If it wasn't America, if it was a lesser country, we would stand back and say, no, thank you, we don't want you to come here at all. Why is America any different, and when will we say no?
I can answer that question. There is nothing Trump could do that would stop us rolling out the red carpet to him, because we have demonstrated very clearly that we value having the relationship with Trump more than any of our other professed values of the country. And, I feel really sorry for the school children in this country who have to endure being lectured about British values when our policy is to treat like a star, like royalty, a president whose policy is despicable and inhumane. And you know what else? This government doesn't have the luxury of getting a pass on this, because we're in a country that also has had a hostile climate policy towards immigrants that has treated immigrants despicably. I mean, Ella mentions Yarlswood. Some of the things that are going on at Yarlswood are also despicable, but this policy, and it is real, it's not an invention, it is a new low, separating children. Let's not forget, some of these children, many of these children potentially, will never be reunited with their parents. This is an extremely serious moment, and it's time that we as a nation take a stand and say what we're about. And if we can't take a stand on this, I'm afraid I have no confidence that we are able to take a stand on anything.
Can I just...
Yes, you.
It might be unpopular, but I firmly believe that if we had a Donald Trump in the UK, we would be in a far better position than what we are.
In what way? Do you want to enlarge on that?
Well, he makes decisions. They might not be popular decisions, but he makes decisions. He sticks by these decisions, and he delivers what he says he's going to do, and he tells the truth.
And you saw the fourth row up there, yes.
Yeah, I think the policies of Donald Trump make Star Wars look like a documentary. I mean, he really is an awful human being. And, we talk about trade in this country. Oh, we need trade deals with America. That's why we need to have a special relationship with him and all the rest of it. But there's something which I think trumps trade, and that is humanity. And he hasn't shown any. He doesn't show any every single day. He just got rid of, voted out of the United Nations Human Rights Convention. And what we're going to do is, and what people like us are going to do, is we're going to protest when he comes. We're going to put him under house arrest, like we did with George Bush during the Gulf War. So there's going to be thousands and thousands of people protesting when he comes, wherever he goes in the UK. And in a sense, what we're going to be is, on that 13th of July, we're all going to be Mexican Jedis saying to Donald Trump, you are not welcome here.
Amen.
Are you going to be one? Are you going to be out there protesting?
Am I going to be up protesting? No. No, look, the only people who can influence Trump are the American people. Now, the American people have long considered the British to be decent, diplomatic, honourable, leadership-type people in the world. They've always admired this nation. And it is our opportunity with Trump coming over here for us to influence the American people by showing them how to treat someone with grace and courtesy, but at the same time to talk to them about the problems that they give the world, the things that they ought to be doing, the way they ought to be doing things differently.
OK. I think we'll move on, because thank you very much. We've only got a short time left. Alicia Gill, let's have your question, please.
With the motion to ban upskirting blocked, should the government be doing more to prevent sexual harassment?
Damien Green.
Yes, and it is. The bill, I think, is going to be introduced to Parliament next week. I think. I can't quite remember next week's business, but as soon as possible, it's going to be there. It was appalling that it was blocked. Upskirting is clearly a disgusting phenomenon that couldn't happen 20 years ago because nobody had camera phones on them. Can happen now, needs to be stopped, will be stopped.
And the second part of the question, should the government be doing more to prevent sexual harassment?
Well, I think that a lot has been done, and some of it can be done by legislation, effectively what governments can do, and some of it is about changing the culture. And I think that's happening in a lot of organisations, and that's a good thing.
Well, it actually brings me back to the question about Trump, because he's also a noted and long-term misogynist, and it's just yet another one of our values we're sacrificing by rolling out the red carpet to him. I would like to see us take this seriously instead of just having tokenistic policies. Why don't we have a feminist foreign policy? Why don't we mainstream women's rights in all of our policies and how we engage with other states, in national security, in trade? We do not take it seriously. It's something that is said about things like upskirting, and not to in any way diminish the importance of this. I absolutely support the ban on upskirting. I was as horrified as I hope everyone else on this panel that it was blocked. But that is not the extent of this issue. These are structural issues that go to the heart of the state. It goes to the heart of how our politicians behave, how companies are rewarded, about the language we use, about the politicians we entertain. I can't take anything anyone says about trying to combat sexual harassment seriously until I see feminism and anti-misogyny mainstreamed into all of our policies in this country.
Potentially the only time I'm going to agree with you, Afi, is the fact that I think that this is in danger of being a tokenistic policy, or a tokenistic nod towards... Yes, because, everyone agrees that upskirting is a vile thing to do, and you don't do it unless you're a seriously twisted and horrible person. But I am really, if there's someone who, believes in women's freedom and is concerned about the state's effect and control over women's freedom, I'm concerned at the kind of cavalier attitude to law and the idea that the state is there to protect women from themselves. I mean, the idea that the government should do more to combat sexual harassment is actually, when you think about it, quite a scary thing, because it means more intervention into women's private lives. It means more intervention into the lives of the engagement between the sexes. And we've seen with the Me Too era, the kind of proposals that are being put forward in relation to workplace regulations, a fear-mongering between the sexes, getting women essentially to be afraid of sex in many ways. The upskirting law is just another one of these ways, I think, in which it's sort of like a sticking plaster over what seems to be an easy issue. But actually, at the heart of it is a question of women's relationship to the state and women's freedom. And I think, cavalier, tokenistic laws do not solve that problem.
So you're not against that law?
I am against that law. I don't think that there's any kind of sensible way in which upskirting could be, if it's proven to be in relation to some kind of sexual assault or harassment. We already have laws on that. What I'm talking about is, because it's a hot political potato, sexual harassment, at the moment, and people like to scaremonger about it and people like to fearmonger about it and panic about it. When you talk to women, normal women living their lives, sexual harassment is not #1 on the political agenda for them. It's not #1 on the political agenda for working mums. And yet we seem to be just wanting to fling laws at it.
What are you basing that on, Ella? What are you basing that on? 1/3 of women in the UK report having been harassed in the workplace, and 70% said they didn't feel able to report it because they were scared. Fearmongering is not allowing women to enforce their rights, not telling them they don't have to endure sexual.
If you look at what this always becomes a kind of... This always becomes a difficult issue, but if you look at, and it's something I feel quite strongly about, because if you look at what is deemed to be sexual harassment today, especially post-Me Too, the definition is so incredibly broad that it's insulting to those of us who have actually suffered sexual abuse or rape or sexual harassment, because it can be something like a touch of the knee, it can be something like an offhand comment. We're not treating sexual harassment seriously, and this is the problem.
Ella,
if you actually want to treat it seriously, you don't speak cavalier in relation
when we were
to
talking
it.
about cannabis, you said we should trust people to be sensible in making their own decisions about the way they use things. Why can't you trust women to use laws against sexual harassment for cases that they
Women aren't calling for this law.
Why would you
There's not mass movements for women. Hang on, this is really important. But this is important.
It may be, but I've only got a minute left.
There's not a mass feminist push for this. Women are not pushing this en masse. It's a state.
I don't know what women are talking to.
I can't add anything to it, really. I mean, it's obviously absurd. I agree with Ella. It seems a shame that the government has to be so involved. But if there is tremendous harassment and this is going on a lot, obviously someone has to put an end to it.
You, sir, at the back there, very briefly, if you would.
I don't quite understand why Chope blocked the bill in the first place. He hasn't really given any justification.
Well, because he disliked the procedure, the parliamentary procedure.
Yeah, he said that himself, but he's backed several private member bills over the past couple of years, so that's absolutely ludicrous.
Okay. John Ashworth, briefly, if you would. Look, I wish we could have the two of you arguing and all the men could sit quiet, but I have my duty to do.
We're happy with that.
Yeah.
Look,
John Ashworth.
there is a role for government. Hopefully we can get this legislation through quickly. It was terrible that MP blocked it. It was a Conservative, but to be fair, virtually every other single Conservative disagreed with him. So it was a lone MP, and nobody in the House of Commons thinks he's done the right thing. So let's get this legislation through quickly, but we've got to change culture as well, obviously.
All right. You on the gangway there, you, ma'am, the woman there. The woman in front of you, I think, had her hand up for a long time. Yes, you.
I work for a women...
No, sorry. Is it your hand?
Yeah.
Oh, right, good. I thought it belonged to the person in front of you. OK, Carol.
I work for Women's Aid, and I can say that the Me Too campaign has been supported by the majority of women, and it's massively empowering.
Can I just
add, raising awareness around consent, that's empowering, it's not scaremongering, it's safe.
All right.
Can I just add as well, just quick, this is not a women's issue. This is not our problem. This is a social issue. We all live in this society. We all want to live in a world where women do not have to go to work or get on the tube or walk down the street fearing sexual harassment. So I would like to communicate that this is not a problem. Ella, you can speak for yourself, but I don't know what planet
you're putting your fear on women.
On.
The majority of women do not feel cowed by men.
And you keep saying the majority of women. Bring me some facts about the majority of women. Go on, bring them.
Come out with me on a night out and you'll meet some women who are not
fearful of men. That's not facts about the majority of women.
It's actually insulting. The last point, it's actually... The problem with this is that it gets to a point where it's insulting for women. It's like with these kind of wilting wallflowers who can't handle an off-colour comment. This is what the Me Too says. It's not about a serious attitude to sexual abuse or rape.
Well,
it's about treating women like children.
We have to stop. I'm sorry. You can all go out. We can all go out together. See how we get on. But we only have an hour on question time, and our time's up, so we have to come to an end.